Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Diana Leon Boyce is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, an affiliate faculty in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies and the Institute for the Study of Latin America and the Caribbean at the University of South Florida. Celeste Wagner, a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania and a graduate affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Diana in just a minute. I'm delighted to note that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Latina and Latino Studies program at Northwestern University. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Celeste will tell us more about Diana's research and career. Then Diana will deliver her seminar. After that, we'll open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at any point in time. Celeste will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Celeste, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo, for the introduction and for inviting me. Hello, everyone on the other side of the screen. I want to thank Mora and Facundo behind the scenes, too, for all of your work. It is a real pleasure for me to be presenting Professor Diana Leon Boyce today at the last event of this truly wonderful spring edition of the virtual seminar series at the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Dr. Diana Leon Boyce is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of South Florida, where she is also an affiliate faculty in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. She holds a PhD in Communications and Media Studies from the Institute of Communication Research at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and an MA in Communication from the University of New Mexico. Dr. Leon Boyce's research and teaching focuses broadly on critical media and cultural studies, with a particular focus on Latinx and girlhood studies, a field where she is a leading scholar. She studies contemporary media representations of girls of color in relation to issues of post-feminism and neoliberalism. Among other venues, she has published her work at the International Journal of Communication, the Journal of Children and Media, Feministas Unidas, Girlhood Studies, as well as on various edited collections such as Latina, Latino, Latinx Communication Studies, and Teaching, Learning, and Intersecting Identities in Higher Education. Her book manuscript, under contract with Rutgers University Press, is titled Princesa of the Periphery, Disney's Flexible Latina Girl. Dr. Diana Leon Boyce is also an awarded scholar and instructor. Among other distinctions, last year she received the prestigious Outstanding Dissertation Award from the Critical Cultural Studies Division at the National Communication Association. Please join me in welcoming Professor Diana Leon Boyce.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Celeste, and thank you everybody for being here virtually in this space. And a special thank you to everybody that has been behind the scenes, not just Mora or Facundo or Pablo or Celeste, but everybody that throughout these last 30, wow, that's a lot of seminars has been just so helpful and instrumental in getting this all rolling. I know that personally, I have looked forward to these every Thursday so much, especially during the pandemic when, we don't really get a lot of that interaction that we're used to. But now I am going to share my screen so that I can present about a little bit about my book. All right, so I'm assuming somebody will tell me if you can't see the screen. So I am thrilled to be here with all of you today to talk a little bit about one of the chapters in my book, the chapter that I call my audiences or theme park chapter. And the title of the talk today is a variation of the title of the chapter in my book. The title is Flexible Latinidad at Disney Theme Parks, a Bi-Coastal Situated Ethnography of Elena of Avalor. But before I go into that, before I actually start talking about the work, I want to note, and Celeste mentioned some of this through the introduction, but I want to note that I approach these texts, all of these Disney texts, Elena of Avalor and everything else that I analyze through a critical cultural studies lens. I'm a media studies scholar, and as such, I understand that at the site of production, there are all sorts of parameters, limits, and contingencies that I am not aware of. So I'm always trying to find out more of that, more on the end of the production, more on the behind the scenes of what's happening. But it's challenging, and currently I don't have any connections, though I might have some coming up soon. And additionally, I also want to note that I celebrate Disney's accomplishments in terms of diversity and equity, especially in animation, while also being very, very mindful of the fact that they're a transnational massive media conglomerate. So as such, the points and the findings that I highlight here through my scholarship, I'm really hopeful that if a production person were to come across these or to come across some of my findings or the things that I note, that they'd be able to implement some of these strategies moving forward with new projects or with new ventures. Now, with that being said, I do want to say that my research is always in conversation with Latinx studies, gender studies, and media and communication studies through a critical cultural studies lens. So it's very interdisciplinary work, always situated somewhere at the intersection of these three circles. And I focus on Latinx studies as a way to interrogate the various ways in which popular culture tames complex hybridity. So I focus specifically on popular culture, especially with the talk that I'm about to give today. But within popular culture, I look at digital spaces as well as legacy media, as I believe that these constitute a media ecology within which racialized and gendered populations make sense of and demands from a mainstream, which has historically excluded them. So my current research addresses a flexible and ambiguous construction of a commodified Latinidad created by a transnational media giant that pursues profit maximization and economic risk aversion. So for those of you who remember or might remember Professor Valdivia's amazing talk from last year, I draw extensively on her work on Disney, girlhood, and princesses, particularly her unambivalent structure of ambivalence, which she broke down for us here last year at her talk. And I extend this work to perform research at the Disney theme parks. So although I will be mostly focusing on that last chapter of my manuscript, I just want to talk a little bit about the rest of the project to give you a better sense of how this chapter that I'm talking about fits in with the overall book. But I do want to pause really quickly and take a step back to note that the book is not out yet. So in case you didn't miss the little section in Celeste's intro, it's under contract with Rutgers, but it's not out yet. So don't open up a tab and try to Google it or search it on Amazon. Hopefully it's coming out soon, so keep an eye out for it, but it's not available quite yet. So on this slide here, you can see the titles of the chapters of the book. And the book at large takes a circuit of culture approach where I address 3 of the nodes of the circuit. I look at the production aspect, I look at text, and I look at reception or audiences, and those are chapters 2, 3, and 4. But before I jump into those case studies, I provide, through chapter 1, a brief overview of Disney from multiple perspectives, including the inception of the corporation, the company's engagements with Latin America, and later US Latinidad from the 1940s all the way to the present moment, and even some of their history with theme parks, both nationally and internationally. So I can gladly talk about any of those chapters if you all would like, but for now, I will focus on chapter 4, which is the last case study of the book, the theme park chapter, which looks at both theme parks in the US. So I do want to quickly highlight, though, how I am using the term flexible or flexibility in my work. You see here in the title that it's a key marker of what I'm doing. And my book extends the work of Iwa Ong and Felicity Amaya Schaefer to conceptualize what I call a flexible Latinidad. Ong argues that flexible citizenship allows disenfranchised individuals in the era of globalization to thrive and adapt amidst uncertain conditions and take advantage of different privileges afforded by their respective nations. Amaya Schaefer then builds on that notion to come up with her pliable citizenship term for contemporary Latinas. Amaya Schaefer's focus then shifts to neoliberalism, gender, post-feminism, and Latinidad to argue that newly minted Latina US citizens enact a malleability in order to ensure that they will not be a threat to the US family or nation. I then build upon both of these concepts to account for Disney's incorporation of what I'm calling a flexible Latina, or a flexible Latina princess, as is the case because it's a Disney animated princess. This flexible Latinidad, in my analysis, is made even more flexible through Elena's existence as a girl in a fantastical animated land and her grounding in Latin America rather than in the US, which of course is something that Professor Valdivia also talked about in her talk. So this, I argue, makes the narrative less threatening and easier for consumption by non-Latinx audiences. This is a flexibility that's ambiguous in order to appeal to that universal audience that Disney is always trying to appeal to. All right, so who is Elena of Avalor? Of course, I'm very well versed in this series and in the animated world of Elena, but I also recognize that a lot of times when I'm presenting on this work, people are not entirely sure what I'm talking about. So before I explain a little bit about the series, I do want to read off two quotes coming from within the Disney family. The first quote is by Nancy Cantor, who is the former general manager of Disney Junior Worldwide. And Nancy says, quote, "Our creative team has delivered a universal story with themes that authentically reflect the hopes and dreams of our diverse audience," end quote. The second quote is by Craig Gerber, who is the executive producer and creator of Elena of Avalor. And Craig says, quote, "What Disney really does well is create fairy tale kingdoms. It makes it very inclusive. You don't have to pick just one nationality. No one really asked if Arendelle was Norway or Sweden. It's just inspired by Scandinavian country. The idea for us was that we wanted Avalor to be more broadly accessible," end quote. So Elena of Avalor is supposed to be broadly accessible, very authentic, yet not specific to one nationality. And this is where a lot of my malleability and the flexibility comes in. Elena is actually Disney's first avowed Latina princess after some fiascos and controversies with Sofia I, though in my work, I find that she's actually not a Latina princess, but rather very firmly situated within Latin America, rather than any type of US Latinidad. So Elena, rather than a full-length feature film, is a television series. The series debuted in 2016. There are 3 seasons of the series, and it actually just wrapped up and came to an end in August of 2020 with the coronation of Elena of Avalor. So Elena is no longer a princess. She is now a queen. And although it's no longer airing new episodes, you can find all of these available on Disney+. So although today I am going to be talking to you about fictive mediated representations, you can see that very clearly here through this image of cartoon characters looking out at you, I really want to underscore that the fictive is rooted in material reality, and the implications of the fictive are very much real. So as many scholars before me have noted, animated content informs children's understandings of the world from a very early age. Understandings of things they know, people they know, places they know, but also understandings about situations and places and people that they may not have ever encountered before. And these conversations, I argue, open up a space for us to study issues of citizenship, recognition, and the nation state. When I think about Elena as a cultural product, which is something that I do in my work, I note that a very important marker of her cultural significance and of the cultural significance of the series at large is that the princess debuted at both theme park locations a few weeks after the series was released. This is indicative of the hopes that Disney had for its, quote, first Latina princess. The character was placed at the theme park space before Disney could gather any wealth of solid data on the reception of the character on the small screen. So the transition from page or screen to the actual theme park was much quicker than it typically is for other Disney characters. All right, so today that is what I'm going to be talking to you about. What happens when Elena leaves the screen and then enters the live dynamic theme park setting. And truly, to say that the cultural significance of Disney theme parks is vast is an understatement. The theme parks are cherished places for many people around the world. And as Stephen Feldman notes, Disney World is, quote, the most ideologically important piece of land in the United States, end quote. Of course, maybe some of you here don't agree with that, but I think that we can all agree that it's pretty significant in terms of the ideological implications that it has. And also, I follow the footsteps of Alexander Wilson, who notes that Walt Disney's theme parks call for special attention because they form the landscape against which Disney's visions meet the historical and political realities of America. And to that, I add that they meet these places as they're happening on the ground. So as these different political and historical realities are happening in real time. Disney theme parks also compose an essential part of the company's synergistic circulation of cultural properties, and it's important to keep in mind how much revenue these entities generate. Just this past year with the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, Disney lost quite a bit of revenue within their sector of theme parks and experiences. And the California theme park, for example, was closed for a little bit over a year. So I just want you all to keep in mind that they form a very important part in terms of revenue for the company. All right, so while there is extensive research on Disney theme parks, like the work of Alan Bryman, Umberto Eco, Stephen Feldman, John Willis, Rebecca Williams, and Janet Wasco, just to name a few, my work is a little bit different. Most of the scholarship studies either the ideological significance of the parks, their influence and place in society, the aesthetics of the parks, as well as a little bit of theme park fandom. And while my work does touch on these various elements, mine is the only work to date that performs an in-depth analysis of the significance of character placement and interactions with park guests, which I argue contributes significantly to larger understandings of gendered Latinidad. One of the really unique aspects of the Disney theme park experiences, and I'm not the only one that thinks this, includes character meetings, the character meet and greets, as they call them on the ground. So here, Disney characters have a chance to circulate beyond the screen and make their way to the actual theme park space. And through these interactions, both children and adults are able to enjoy a temporary corporeal experience with their favorite animated characters brought to life by real life performers. And I included here on the right side of this screen just a quick screen grab of my own personal Disneyland mobile application, just to show you how easy it is to track the characters at the park. So if you want to find Cinderella or Snow White or whoever it is, you go to the app, you scroll through and you see how and where to find these people. So through the theme park chapter of my book, I trace how it is that park guests, and park guests is the official terminology that Disney use, how they interact with this cultural product, how they interact with the cultural product of Elena. And I understand the princess here as a product that Disney moves around and plays with at the parks very strategically. The conglomerate makes very strategic decisions about how to position her in various locations and what to highlight, when to highlight it, or what not to highlight. So from the previous chapter of my book, we know that previous chapters, I should say, we know that Elena is part of Disney's strategic attempts to increase revenue and expand their audience base through the representation of a non-white princess, particularly according to the company through a Latina princess. But before I started working on this ethnographic section, I really just wondered so much of what happens when we get to encounter, when audiences get to encounter this princess or this character on the ground. And these questions that you see here are the questions that I address by sharing my modified situated ethnographies, which were conducted at both of the theme parks. All right, so conducting research at the theme parks, I am not going to lie, it was much more challenging than I anticipated it was going to be. I knew it was going to be difficult, but I didn't necessarily expect it was going to be that challenging, especially when trying to capture the evanescent interaction between park guests and cast members and attractions and all of this stuff just happening simultaneously. So in order to trace the various elements surrounding the inclusion of Elena at the parks, I had to develop a nimble methodology consisting of various methods, which included pre and post digital analyses, as well as on-site ethnography. This innovative method allowed me to analyze on-site performance of Latinidad by Elena princesses at both Disneyland in California and Disney World in Florida, alongside audience interactions to and interactions with and reactions to the princess. So what you see on this slide is the various screenshots of the Disneyland mobile application, my personal application. And this is just to give you a sense of the various things that you can do through the mobile app. You can order food, get tickets, access the pictures that are professionally taken at the park, get your fast passes, and now you even reserve your space in line because of the CDC guidelines and how they've been limiting capacity and limiting the number of people that can get on the actual rides or the lines for the rides. So really, this is just to show you how much of the theme park experience is guided by and dependent upon the mobile application. And although the app did launch in 2013, so that was about 8 or so years ago, the app has changed quite a bit throughout the years, and they've been making additions and implementing all sorts of things to enhance the experience, as they like to say, for the park guests, for the audiences, right? But it's actually also a really great way for Disney to keep up with their guests, to track audiences and to see what's going on the ground. And Disney has a wealth of data through the app and through all sorts of various touch points that they're actually not shy at all about revealing. In fact, as part of the Disney Investor Day 2020 report in December 10th, 2020, Bob Chapek, who is the current Disney CEO, explained on many occasions that every decision that the conglomerate makes is driven by the data they collect. He frequently referenced the wealth of data and the, quote, unique touch points that the conglomerate has across all businesses. So this includes theme parks as well. And I just wanted to note here that it's an easy way for audiences and for guests to navigate their way through the parks, but it's also a great way for Disney to notice trends and to highlight what's happening on the ground. And what they end up doing is they use these trends and all of these touch points, as Chapek noted, to make decisions from what kind of food to include on the menus, to the characters that they're going to highlight at the parks, to how even they're going to highlight the characters or when to highlight them. So Disney theme park experiences are vastly different than they were 10 years ago. And it would be incredibly challenging, I argue, to conduct an analysis of the theme park spaces without including all of these digital components that go into the theme park experience. And one of the really unique aspects of my project, or my ethnographic approach, which I call a modified situated ethnography, a bicoastal situated ethnography, is this blending of on-site, on the ground observations and also digital data collection. So for the purposes of time, I'm just going to quickly go through this, but please ask me any questions about the method if you have questions later on. I will mention though too that I think this modified ethnography would be an easy type of approach to take, not just when examining other theme park spaces, but also within tourism studies, especially studies that integrate or incorporate some kind of digital component. So these are the 3 stages or images that represent the 3 stages of my work. The first stage was digital through the mobile application. The second stage was on the ground at the theme park. And then the third stage here was also digital, where I collected my data through the mobile application. And the process was a combination of a lot of things: photo documentation, which was heavily guided by the work of Charles Suchar, participant observation, and also critical technocultural discourse analysis guided by the work of Andre Brock, where I combined all of these and more to study frequency and patterns at the theme parks, both digitally and on the ground. So the study itself spanned the course of 4 days at both theme parks, 4 physical days at the parks, along with 120 days of digital data collection. And the first stage included extensive research of what I call the representation of possibility. And this representation of possibility was the representation of possibility for encountering Elena of Avalor as it was indicated on the mobile application. So at this stage, I analyzed the application. I analyzed the Elena of Avalor page and the many places where it said that she would appear. prior to my visit to the theme park space. And once I was there, I would trace and see whether or not this was consistent with what was actually happening on the ground. The second stage took place at the park, or I should say at the parks. I visited both theme park locations 11 months apart. At the California location, I was there for a little bit over 25 hours over a 2-day period on July 21st and 22nd of 2018. And at the Florida location, I was there for a little bit over 20 hours on June 2nd and June 3rd of 2019. So almost exactly 2 years from now. And during this portion of the analysis, I interacted with the mobile application, the princess, the park, guests, and other attractions simultaneously, just like any other park guest would do. And I must also acknowledge here that I navigated this space fully immersed as a Disney fan, as a Disney theme park goer, standing in line with other park guests, engaging in conversations with them, and wearing Disney t-shirts, Disney clothing. Also, on a few of these occasions, my daughter accompanied with me and stood in line with me to meet the princess. Additionally, for this stage that was on the ground and at the actual theme park, I must note that I did not conduct any formally structured interviews or plan any part of my participant observation. My experience at both of these parks was organically guided by the events that unfolded once I was on the ground. Additionally, my shared observations from the parks do not refer to any unknown individual who can be identified. So then when I wrapped up the theme park visits, I went back home and I conducted the third and final stage, which was immediately following my time at the parks. And it consisted of tracking Disneyland and Disney World's representation of possibility of Elena of Avalor again for 30 days. So I did this in order to ensure a full circle of pre-production, production, and post-production of Elena at the park and virtually. This stage was meant to be a replication of the first stage. However, and this is where the modified part comes in, following my visit to the California theme park, I decided I needed to modify my strategy or my approach given my observations on the ground. So what happened when I was on the ground is that on my second day there, I noticed that the appearances or the times that were advertised on the mobile application for when Elena was supposed to come out, halfway throughout the day on the second day, they were all removed. So I thought, I need to go back, and instead of checking the app once a day, I need to log in at 9 a.m., noon, 5 p.m., and 7:30 p.m. just to get a better sense of whether or not this is consistent, or maybe it was just a fluke while I was there for that second day. And this is, like I said, where the modification of my strategy comes in. So then I took that new approach and did that for my Florida theme park. All right, so now, after I just breezed through that method part, for the remainder of the talk, I want to just address the findings, address some of the key things that happened at both of the theme park spaces when I was looking for Elena, interacting with Elena, and meeting her alongside other park guests. And before I start this section, what I'm going to do is highlight two distinct conversations that I noted. One conversation at each theme park, because I think that will set the backdrop nicely for what followed after that. So this first conversation that I highlight is from my fieldwork in California. And the quote is a conversation that I had with a lovely family from Sonora. I was talking to a guest in line in front of me who was waiting in line to meet Elena. And we just had a casual conversation about where they were from, why they were there, why they were excited to meet the princess. And one of the cousins notes, quote, "Tengo una sobrina que le encanta todo lo de Elena. Pasan su programa allá en el Netflix de Sonora en español. Dice Jimena que le encanta porque es la primera princesa mexicana. Voy a tener que llamarle a Jimena por el FaceTime para que vea que sí habla español también aquí en Disneylandia." End quote. Translation, quote, "I have a niece who loves everything about Elena. They show the series in Spanish on the Netflix in Sonora. Jimena says that she loves her because she's the first Mexican princess. I'm going to have to call Jimena on FaceTime so she can see that she also speaks Spanish here in Disneyland." End quote. Then, and I'll break these down later, but for now I'm just reading the quotes as they pertain to each location. The second quote that I highlight is from my field work in Florida, and the quick conversation goes as follows. A park guest approaches Elena and asks her, "Elena, ¿hablas español? Elena, do you speak Spanish?" And Elena replies, quote, "Sí, princesa, but my grandmother asked me to practice my English today, and we are in Cinderella's kingdom, so I should speak English here." End quote. All right, so this slide showcases some of the most prominent findings while I was on the ground, though I'm sure that there's so much more that I could touch on that pertains to each one of these, but I'll just give a quick rundown here, because really what my ethnography demonstrated was that the performance of the princess, and when I say princess, I'm referring to all the different women that I saw playing this role at the theme parks, that the performance of the princess varies drastically from coast to coast. So such a finding suggests that the inclusion of the princess and Latinidad by extension at the parks is malleable and ever-changing, varying according to the geographic setting and dependent on many other factors, which the conglomerate does not disclose. So in Anaheim, Elena is situated outside of the Royal Hall, which is where the most prominent Disney princesses live. She's outside of the hall. She gets really short 5-minute intervals, about 4 or 5 times a day. And based on my observations following my theme park visit, more than half of those times were removed for the 30 days following the trip. So she's outside underneath the purple umbrella, not inside the Royal Hall. She's also a Spanish-speaking Elena. In Anaheim, Elena spoke prominently and communicated with guests at length in Spanish. A lot of times when the guests would approach her, and other times, even if it was somebody that maybe didn't speak Spanish, Elena would say, adios, princesa, or hasta luego, or mucho gusto, throwing in random Spanish phrases every once in a while. Also, at Anaheim, Elena was very much fixed within a Mexicanidad, which I will explain in a second. And in Orlando, she was inside the Royal Hall next to Cinderella in an incredibly prominent position for 10 hours a day on average. A lot of times it was more, including the before and after magic hours. And she promoted discourses of practicing her English, which again, I'll talk about in a second here. And she was not Mexicana here. She was ambiguously ethnic. So now what I'm going to do is break down those points from the previous slide and theoretically ground them and situate them within the locations where they belong. I titled the slide, The Elena of Avalor Mexicana and the Elena of Avalor que no habla español. And since its inception, I think I mentioned this briefly in the beginning, but I'll say it again. The creative team behind Elena of Avalor and a lot of Disney executives have worked very hard to promote the princesses and the series Latinidad. Often referencing their complex research practices, the creative team highlights the series' links to Latinidad, and they often fluctuate between she's a Latina, she's a Latin princess, she's inspired by Latin America, she's Hispanic, going back and forth between all of these. And this is something that I talk about extensively in my production chapter. And it's also something that Professor Valdivia noted in her talk, that it's a common practice, right? Conflating and lumping the Latin America and the US Latinx, which is something that's very much happening here within the series and the princess herself. And this strategy, truly what it does is it allows for a safe consumption of what is supposedly Latinidad. But when Disney includes these princesses at the US theme park locations, and also on the screen, but specifically at the theme park locations, it does so in a way that signifies non-threatening diversity to attract Latinx and non-Latinx viewers alike, right? That's the goal. You attract as many audiences as possible. So the inclusion of Elena as a non-threatening Latina princess is a response to demographic trends and market demands appealing to diverse consumers, wherein the ideological work of whiteness is not necessarily disrupted. So in California, one of the most prominent situations that emerged was this fixity of Elena and her kingdom as Mexican rather than Latinx. And while I was there during my actual on the ground work at the park, rather than notice a rhythm of ambiguity and specificity, something which I find in the text chapter of my book, I only witnessed a Mexican specificity. At the park, I located Elena's Mexicanidad, both through the audience's interpretations of her and their interactions with her, and also through Elena's interactions with the audiences, and also through the very scripted nature of the experience. Elena showcases her Mexicanidad in California, mostly via language and food. In California, not only does Elena communicate with guests in Spanish for extended periods of time, like I already mentioned, which was honestly, it was so lovely to see that. It was particularly special and important for my daughter to see and to communicate with the character in Spanish at a US theme park. But really interesting to note here is that Elena used phrases that are common in Mexico. And I am Mexican myself, so this is something that I didn't really realize until later. Phrases such as a poco, for really, or que padre, when she would say that something was exciting or cool. And que padre actually came up quite a bit. So kids would say, I just rode Splash Mountain, or I'm gonna go eat next. I'm gonna go meet this other princess. And she'd be like, ay, que padre. And then what are you doing after that? And it was actually not until later that I was talking to somebody from Chile that I realized that que padre is not necessarily common in other places. And that's where I, started learning a lot of things about this too, and how it's so Mexican specific here. Additionally, the women who were playing Elena in California only referenced Mexican cuisine in Spanish. And you might be wondering, like, why are they referencing cuisine? What are they talking about? But the women that were playing the part actually referenced food and cuisine quite a bit. And this is also something that I noticed with Tiana as well, talking a lot about the foods that they make, the foods that they like to eat, even though at times, at least in my opinion, this seemed a little bit out of place. So the women that were playing Elena in California referenced tamales, tacos, churros, and tres leches on several occasions, even though Disneyland, to my knowledge, only sells one of those items, the infamous churros. So the women playing the part were calling on and drawing on the Mexicanidad through their references to food, and also through the very specific language that they would communicate in. And then also this happened on behalf of the audiences as well. The audiences showcased and highlighted Elena's Mexicanidad by referring to her as the Princesa Mexicana. And you'll recall the quote that I read a few slides ago. This was not limited to my conversation with this family. It happened multiple times. One of the times it actually happened with my cousin, who came for an hour or two to meet up with me at the park. And she's in her early 30s. Back then she didn't have any children. And she's like, who are we meeting? Why are we in line to meet this person? And when I said, she goes, la princesa mexicana, right? Like the Mexican princess. So this happened multiple times. In California, although Disney has officially included Spanish at the park, the conglomerate is able to minimize its use or take it away at any given moment. Recall that I said that they stripped Elena of those appearances the month following my visit. And this is consistent with Bonnie Orcioli's findings of Spanish use in the inner spheres versus the outer spheres. Here, Elena's safe and consumable Spanish becomes a commodity at Disneyland. And Bonnie Orcioli notes that languages other than English become ethnically safe when they're used in very carefully scripted contexts, such as print and electronic media, emblematic language in festivals and parades, waiters with accents at restaurants. Language in the outer sphere is highly policed and structured. So as part of the outer sphere, the Disneyland theme park showcases Spanish through its only Spanish-speaking princess. And the fact that the Spanish-speaking Elena is contained at the park, where Disney can mold her in real time, makes sense as a corporate strategy to avoid risk. Although in terms of the Mexicanidad, I will note that we need to be mindful, and I'm very mindful of where California is located and the Mexican-American and Mexican composition of this space. Perhaps all of these women that were cast to play this part are Mexican, and they're using their own language and their own terminology and bringing it into the character. So I am very mindful of that. I just wanted to specify that here. But what unfolded at the Orlando location was drastically different. In Orlando, during my trip, Elena held a prominent position inside the fairy tale hall and beside Cinderella, no less. And you can even see here, 60 minutes for wait time. And sometimes it was up to 90 minutes. So she was in a very prominent position inside the hall. What I was able to identify through my 62 days of data collection is that the overrepresentation of Elena at the park matched perfectly with the overrepresentation on the mobile application, which is very different than my experience in California. So for those 2 days that I was on the ground, and for the additional 60 days when I would check the application multiple times a day, Elena appeared for an average of 10 uninterrupted hours at the park. But then what happens when there's this overrepresentation of Elena at the park with those 10 uninterrupted hours of dynamic audience interactions with the princess? Here, Elena is not a Mexicana and she does not speak Spanish. The quote that I read briefly at the beginning of the section was similar to other instances where Elena would explain that she was working hard to, quote, practice my English. And again, I need to specify that this is not just one woman that was saying these lines. It was different characters, different people that were playing the part. So on another occasion, the actresses playing the part would also mention that practicing English takes a lot of work in lines such as these. These are conversations and lines that were uttered by all but one of the women that was playing the part of Elena during my 2 days at the Orlando location during the summer of 2019. At Orlando, I saw 4 different women playing the role. And like I said, only one of these women did not mention that she didn't speak English or that she should practice her English or that she should speak English in that space. These conversations were always prompted though. They only happened when either somebody would approach her and ask her to speak in Spanish, or if a family or a person would just immediately come to her in Spanish, she would utter these lines after that. And it's also important to note that these are not coincidences, as Disney heavily scripts these cast members. So additionally, in Orlando, Elena does not directly reference any cuisine from a specific country or a region, but rather mostly focuses on talking about clothing, accessories, and celebration discourses, narratives that position her within a traditional femininity and middle-class consumerism. I talk a lot about this in the chapters, specifically the post-feminist element to it and the whole consumerism narratives, but for now, I'm just going to fly by them a little bit for the purposes of time, but I will note that the discourses about celebrations that she often invokes position her as external to Disney. So she'll say, where I'm from, we celebrate this, or back where I'm from, when we celebrate birthdays, we have huge cakes, or always positioning her as external, as outside of Disney. So she's coming here from a place that's outside of Disney. The specificity of the princess in Anaheim is located, so this is Orlando, the specificity of Elena in Anaheim is located on the periphery, on the margin, literally on the periphery of the Royal Hall, where she is stripped of most of her appearances anyway. But in Florida, we have a vastly different situation where there's an English-only speaking princess who does not draw on any cultural markers to specify or nail her down to any kind of Latinidad, and appears inside for prominent and extended periods of time. So I will note here though, and this contributes to the dynamic nature of it all, a year before I visited the Florida park, when I was doing my California work, I saw a video of Elena speaking, a video on Instagram of Elena speaking inside the Royal Hall to a family in Spanish. It was here in Florida. It was a different actress than I saw, but you know, I think that just speaks to how dynamic and how things change so very often at the theme parks, and because of reasons that I cannot tap into, as I don't work for Disney or I'm not part of the Disney Corporation. The language discourses at both parks are very much situated within national and political discourses. In California, Elena communicates in Spanish nonstop, right, with people for extended periods of time. Whereas in Florida, she's working hard to practice her English and doesn't speak in Spanish to any of the guests while I was there, while I was on the ground. The lines that she invokes at the Florida location are very reminiscent of statements made about the use and place of Spanish in this nation. And I'm sure, unfortunately, that we are all familiar with such statements. Like I said, Disney is well aware of the national demographics on both coasts of the nation and what this means in terms of what the visitors might expect. Sabrina Mittermeier actually just published this phenomenal book earlier this year, where she traces the cultural history of the theme parks, of the Disney theme parks. And when she explains the history behind the inception of the Florida park, she notes that, quote, the East Coast of the United States drew different demographics than Disneyland on the West Coast, including many international visitors. The Magic Kingdom then had to deal with a different audience. This was reflected in its lineup of attractions, however cautiously, end quote. So this is exactly what I found when I was doing my research on the ground at the theme parks in relation to Elena's placement and the reception of the princess by park guests. So what's going on in terms of the different compositions? Well, it's dynamic and it's very layered, but in terms of the actual Latinidades, the states themselves, Florida and California, host very different kinds of Latinx populations. Florida, for example, during the past election, made many headlines, national headlines, which indicated the surprise for how Florida voted, for how the Latinx population voted, although, it shouldn't have been that surprising. But in Miami-Dade County, for example, Trump took 61% of the 482 majority Latino precincts, up from 26% of them in 2016. That's a pretty significant jump. And I think that this goes to show that the Latinx vote is just as complex as the various identities that comprise Latinxes in this nation. Florida contains a very powerful Latinx assimilationist presence, of which the majority is conservative. And I live here now, and I've only lived here for a year, and I can very much attest to that. Voting patterns, politics, and cultural differences are vast within Latinx populations, particularly as they relate to assimilationist viewpoints. Although he was focusing on an educational setting, Jonathan Rosa traces the discourses surrounding language shifts from Spanish to English, and he notes that they are interpreted as signs of progress. He finds that the goal for racially minoritized subjects is to supplant or supplement their perceived home language practices. These efforts towards the modification of racially minoritized individuals' linguistic practices are rooted in a troublesome accumulation-based theory of change that promotes the acquisition of cultural and linguistic capital. These popular discourses demonstrate how Latinx difference and the racialization of Spanish is linked to anxieties about race, which are often connected to issues of language. So to ease some of these tensions, Disney perhaps produces a Latina princess who is vocal in Florida about how much she's practicing her English and how she only speaks English in this space, signaling thus linguistic progress and assimilation to prove that she is a worthy guest in Cinderella's kingdom. So also, Disney is mindful of its local tourist flows, not just the Latinxes within Florida and within California, but also who's visiting these parks from internally, like from the US. And how are these local demographics going to respond to the use of Spanish at the park and to a Latina princess? Florida is situated on the east coast of the US and firmly within the deep South. The cultural and political makeup is vastly different than that of California on the west coast of the nation. And yes, of course, I understand that there are shifts. Throughout the years, there have been many shifts, but the deep South tends to be politically conservative, although this can often be attributed to gerrymandering and voter suppression. And of course, I want to be the first to note that it's not as simple as whether it's a conservative space or not, but a lot of that factors into the use of language and understandings about the place of language in certain locations. I think we need to be also mindful of the time periods when these discourses were happening on the ground. So Disney personnel are aware that many of the experiences at the parks can be unpredictable. And because of this, the conglomerate implements as much control as it possibly can. The beauty of the theme park setting is that Disney can alter cast member decisions in real time without adjusting too much or any of its media content. For instance, the conglomerate can adapt or change the language spoken by a certain character or adjust the script depending on the data that they obtain. Disney can even go as far as removing the characters altogether. The theme parks are constantly going through updates and adjustments based on the data that Disney is eager to explain it has, yet never actually discloses. A lot of these adjustments, though, have been great, and they indicate a sign of progress. At the theme parks, I have noticed so many transitions and so many changes that are indicative of hopefully better things to come. Upon a superficial glance, the Florida and California locations might seem like the same Disney park operating on different coasts of the nation. However, this is not the case. Each park was created differently, and it operates within the cultural, geographic, and political landscape present in its respective state. These discourses are further influenced by the types of tourism that each of the locations attract, locally and internationally. My analysis in this chapter demonstrates that at the Florida park, Elena's existence and the discourses that she perpetuates differs from her presence in the California park. Such findings allow us to understand that the inclusion of the princess and Latinidad at the parks is malleable and situated within specific geographic settings. And also it depends on various unpredictable social and political factors. My theme park case study, among other things, reveals a consistent positioning of this princess as an outsider in relation to the world of Disney. Disney's creation of a flexible Latina on the periphery is not careless. the conglomerate is aware of the potentials and challenges that could come with including this first Latina princess, especially within the theme park space, where there's live interaction and so much happening with theme park guests like at the moment. So through this theme park analysis, I was able to back up Angaret Valdivia's claim in her latest book that introducing a new set of characters with relational attributes that do not take away from the moral high ground represented by whiteness, yet expand tired stereotypes proves to be a difficult task. It really does. It's an incredibly challenging task, which I think I was able to uncover through this ethnography. So how do you write a television show or a television story or a character for everyone? One that will not alienate non-Latinxes, but will bring in basically everyone around the globe. How do you do that? And then how do you translate that and put it into a theme park space? And these are all questions that I assume Disney is carefully thinking through as they continue to showcase this asset through the theme park spaces. My work makes it clear how Disney continues to attempt to deal with the heterogeneity that's present within Latinidad. And with that, I will stop and open it up to the next phase of this seminar.
Thank you so much, Diana. This was a wonderful talk. I loved hearing you so clear, and I just can't wait to discuss more with you and the audience now during the Q&A. So I will take the privilege of being moderator of this fascinating talk and ask a first question. I found like this analysis that you were doing about the differences between the theme parks and how Elena's flexible identity is portrayed so interesting. And as you mentioned, these parks are ideological sites that are visited by people all around the country and the world. And it's interesting because they are almost like universal or magical, like detached from material reality to a point, but no, they are located in specific places. And based on what you were discussing and what you said about the production side of this and how much like data driven and carefully crafted everything is at Disney, I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more on what you were discussing about the international communities who visit these parks and the role that they might have. How do you think that these different audiences shape this flexible Latinidad that is portrayed? And I'm thinking of maybe guests from different countries in Latin America who might go to certain places, or guests from all over the world, maybe from Asia, who, because of geography, people might tend to go to certain parks more than others. So yeah, just wondering about that.
That's a great question. And thanks for asking that, because it's in the chapter, but again, it can't all make its way into the talk. But that was actually one of the things that for some reason I hadn't fully considered before going to the theme park spaces. I had been to the California park a few times because I have family in Tijuana and in other places in California, but I hadn't been to the Florida park since I was like 10, I think. So what I did notice, and what I think I usually notice when I'm in the California park or at the Anaheim park, is that, like I said, yes, there is much more of a Mexican presence there, whether it's Mexican American or actually people coming from Mexico, like the family from Sonora. A lot of this that I get though, and I will tell you, I am not very good at picking up accents or catching accents. I'm one of those people that just doesn't have an ear for that. But I notice this from conversations that I have with people, because I'm one of those people that will be in line and I'm just talking to everyone, even before ethnography, this ethnography, just like, what are you doing here? Where are you from? Oh, so that's where I noticed in California. And that's typically how I've noticed throughout the years after having attended Disneyland in California a few times, that there is a very strong Mexican and Mexican American presence in that space. My cousins, for instance, and a lot of their friends, they go from Tijuana all the way, which for me seems like such a big trip, right? From Tijuana all the way to Anaheim. And they do this pretty often. And it's something that they're just, they're used to, at least pre-pandemic, they're used to visiting this space a lot. What I will tell you that I think from the very beginning opened up my eyes to these differences at the park in the Florida space is that not only in terms of international tourists, but national tourists, I immediately saw that difference. And like I said, I'm not very good at picking up on accents, but I could immediately tell when I entered the space that it was very different from California. I heard accents that later on then my partner was able to help me understand were from Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee. And I'm like, how do you understand these accents? But I noted that along with a very prominent Brazilian presence. And a lot of these, I really want to say that this happened at least like 6 times. A lot of these people that were coming from Brazil, you get people that approach the princess and they try to talk to her not just in Spanish, but also in Portuguese, which I thought was fascinating. And Elena would bring up a lot of these similar discourses of, oh, okay, well, it's great to meet you, but here I'm working on my English, so I'm going to communicate with you in English. There was a young boy at one point who she told that she said, I speak Spanish, I speak Portuguese, I speak French, she mentioned all of these languages. She's like, but today we're going to speak English here. So this goes back to that comment that you made about like the fantastical, right? It just detaches it from any type of material reality, although it's not. It's very much like situated and firmly planted within it. But I did notice that the audiences on both coasts of the nation were drastically different. Like this makeup was just so different. And like I said, I don't know how these decisions are made, but I can only imagine that these types of observations influence the scripting and the decisions that are made about what Elena should and shouldn't do. Unfortunately, before the pandemic, I had big dreams and big hopes to travel to Euro Disney in Europe to conduct that, like an international analysis of what happens there. Because anecdotally, I've heard from a lot of people that they claim her as the Spanish princess, or she's the princess that people watch in Spain and can relate to. This is all anecdotal though. I haven't conducted any research there. But unfortunately, that was kind of shut down with COVID. So now maybe I'll get to do that follow-up work later next year, if she's even still present at the Euro Disney location, because I know that prior to the pandemic, she was very visible. Her and Sophia the First in Paris were very visible through the parades and through the meet and greets. So I'd be really interested to see how the audience is there in affect how Elena narrates whatever it is, whether it's being an external force outside of Disney or whether it's language. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. We have great questions from the audience, so I will start reading a few. Arcelia Gutierrez asks, can you talk about the differences in casting practices in Orlando versus Anaheim? Racially, the casting appears to be different from the pictures you provided. How about any audible ethnic accents? So
I'll start with the second part, and I'll apologize to Arcelia because I'm not very good at accents or catching them. But if you mean accents from the women playing the part, Arcelia, I did not detect any accents from 4, 5, 6, 7 different cast members that I saw playing the part at both of the theme parks. The only thing linguistically that I did notice were those words, like those specific Spanish phrases that specific to Mexico that I noted. But in terms of accent, even when I go back through my videos, because I have a lot of videos of, it's perfectly normal at Disney to like record your child or record an experience with the princess, which just actually made it really easy for my ethnographic experience because it's so normal to pull your phone out and record. But even when I go back through them and I have tried to listen for accents, I really can't. I can't really tell that there are any differences there. And then your first question was about the casting. In terms of the casting practices, while I was actually there on the ground, I noticed that phenotypically, these women were very similar in terms of like skin color and the hair. They have to wear the same wig, even body shape. But I have seen images since then circulating where I've been really excited to see that there's a much darker Elenas at the theme park. I think mostly it's in Florida, in the theme park space. So like I said, though, I don't know how these casting decisions are made or how the casting process works. All I have are just the blogs that I read from like formerly disgruntled Disney cast members who just talk about how intense it is to be in costume and to always be in character. But other than that, I don't really have any information about the actual like casting process or how those decisions get made. But what I did see at the park was very similar, at least in terms of phenotype. And then there's another part of the question or no?
Yes, I feel that you responded to that one earlier.
Oh, and the second one, interactions with guests. In terms of your interaction with guests in line at the park, can you talk about who visit? Oh, I did. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, we have a question from Jess Rauchberg, who says, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you if Elena is featured in Walt Disney World and Disneyland virtual tours or other digital Disney sites. If she is, are there significant differences in how she's represented in person in the parks in comparison to these digital representations?
So the only type of digital analysis that I did was like how the application represented the possibility of encountering her. Virtual tours, I haven't looked into virtual tours. You mean, I'm wondering now that you say that, I'm going to make a note of it because I bet that there's a lot of like virtual Disney experiences post-COVID. In the very beginning, early days of the pandemic, when we thought that maybe it was just going to be like a 2-month shutdown, I remember like logging into, I don't even remember what sites, but doing a lot of like the virtual Disney rides. That was kind of odd, but I don't remember any type of like specific like character encounters virtually. That's a great suggestion though, because I do want to look into that to see how maybe through virtual tours, how she's represented. The only thing that I've been really able to tap into recently, and I say very recently, like within the last 3 to 4 weeks, at least since they opened the Anaheim location, are the meet and greets now. And I believe it's 15 feet. They have 15-foot separation between 3 cast members and the audiences that rotate. So the scripting is different from what I've been able to digitally observe. And by digitally, I mean recorded of like in-person moments. But there's not the personal conversations that used to happen at the park when I was there. It's more like from really far away, she's saying like, hi, welcome to the park. And then like next person goes. But I know I don't really have any data on virtual tours, like virtual Disney tours and how Elena appears there. And then the second part, do you see these digital representations shift Elena's flex? Yeah, unfortunately, I can't answer that part of the question because I haven't really looked into virtual tours, into the Disney virtual tours with cast members. So it's a really great suggestion that's now in my notebook. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to go to one very interesting question about methods now. Bryce Henson asks, can you elaborate on your modified situated ethnography? Theme parks don't seem to permit a traditional ethnography that relies on notions of thick description or immersion or extended time in a given locale. How do you adapt ethnography to these interactive stages of performance between characters and audiences?
That is a great question. So one of the things that I try to be really mindful of when developing this method was the fact that this is not a stable environment. So everything is, like I said, constantly changing. And I really feel that my experience at the park is similar to an experience that anybody would have on any given time or date when they would meet or go to Disney or meet the princess or get into the rides or whatnot. It's very dynamic and it's a very fluid and ever-changing situation where I also really wanted to be mindful of how important being guided by the mobile application was, because like I said, it's just such a central portion and part of the experience. Let's see, that relies on thick description or immersion. Right, okay, so you're talking about the extended time. This is a great question because I'm actually in the very early stages of talking to a colleague of mine to see if we can collaborate on developing a method that is similar to what I have here, but can be adapted to other settings where you can't really immerse yourself for an extended period of time, like a World Cup or music festivals or parades or things like that, right? Spectacles that you cannot be a part of for really extended periods of time, or really interact with many like locals or people that are part of that community, because it's not permanent. It's not a permanent location. It's not a permanent situation. And although the Disney theme park is permanent, like it's there, the experience is so dynamic and so fluid that this, for me, this was the best way that I could think of to approach that and adapt it to a setting that was constantly shifting. But I'm really hopeful that this is a method that other people, that I can work on with my colleague to create at least a blueprint or a starting off point for other people to use this method, whether it relies heavily on mobile applications or not, in spaces that are not permanent, or spaces that are changing and maybe in a period only for a small amount of time, maybe like even like a marathon or something like that. So I think I answered performance. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There's a question from Mary Beltran who asks, well, thank you for presenting your fascinating study. I can't wait to learn more. I've done some research on the Disney television character based on a real life legend, El Fego Vaca, in the late 50s and early 60s. I understand this character also appeared at Disneyland, but sadly was unable to find further documentation on the appearance of the character at Disney. I did learn that Mexican food at the park at the time only consisted of a restaurant sponsored by Frito-Lay. They were famous for Frito pie, which was passed off as Mexican food. So what presence of Latino food and culture did you find in the theme park outside of Elena during your ethnographic research?
This is a great question, because it was actually very different. And here I'm just going to specifically talk about the Disneyland, because then if you go to Epcot, it's a whole world of different Mexican signifiers, which sometimes they try to use to stand in for Latin America and Latinidad at large. But at Disneyland, outside of any meet and greets with Elena or any place where she's available, there are a lot of stands that sell like snacks and treats with tajin, or like they have duvalin. I'm trying to think of other like snacks that I was really familiar with, when I was growing up, or anytime I go back to Mexico. They have those a lot not at like the brick and mortar stores, but at the stands where they sell fruit or treats. I saw none of that in Florida. Now that I'm thinking back, I mean, other than the churros that are just everywhere, and apparently one of the top foods to document on Instagram at Disneyland is a churro. But other than that, I didn't see any of that in Florida, which I think, again, goes back to that finding that things are different, and Disney is making different decisions on the West Coast than they are on the East Coast, even if they maybe aren't permanent decisions or permanent situations. But I do know that restaurant that you're talking about, and I actually very briefly talk about it in a paper that I just wrote for the International Journal of Communication on Galaxy's Edge. It's about the specific Star Wars themed area, and we talk about Dr. Christopher Chavez and I, in this piece, we talk about Disney's layout and Frontierland and all of these transitions that Disneyland, specifically in California, has gone throughout the years. And we talk a little bit about these spaces that were often always on the periphery as well, especially this restaurant that you say was sponsored by Frito-Lay. So I know all about that, Mary, but I'm actually going to look into that character that you say. I want to see if I can find anything about that, to see if maybe we can connect later, and I can let you know if I find any documentation about the appearances of that character. You'd be surprised at how much fans have to contribute on online forums. So there might be someone there that can help you, and then maybe I can, help you figure that out. Yeah, but I think that answers that question, or at least as best as I could.
Yeah, no, this has been so interesting. I know that we have extended our time a little bit, and I want to be I'm very grateful for everyone who's been staying. But I was thinking we could wrap up here and just thank you very much for your time and also for the awesome questions from the audience.
Yes,
Um,
thank you so
I
much.
don't know, Pablo. Oh,
Oh, I
let's
just
see
want
you.
to say that after the seminar, I will get in touch with Professor Valdivia and I'll answer your question there.
Thank you very much, Celeste. Thank you very much, Diana. And I apologize for those past questions who we have not had time to answer, but we are 10 minutes after time, and I know some people have to go. I want to thank Celeste for great moderation. I want to thank Diana for an incredible seminar, super engaging. Couldn't think of a better way to wrap up this first year of the seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, seminar number 30. I want to thank the audience for staying with us to the end. We will post the lineup for the fall quarter in about a week to 10 days, so stay tuned. I wish everybody those of you who are in the Northern Hemisphere, a wonderful summer. In the Southern Hemisphere, a good winter. And I will see everybody hopefully towards the end of September when we start the year 2 of this seminar series. Thank you very much again, Diana, Celeste, and everybody in the audience.